medium on this stuff. That's water based.
Okay, apparently we're waiting for one of the people. Right, so shall I start?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to present this talk. In actual fact, the last time I presented it was a couple of years ago, and the audience was about, the average age, I guess, was around 70, which is kind of interesting. So it's actually geared towards, a general audience. It's more of a public lecture, and I'm glad that there are also people from other departments in attendance. I think some of you know me. Those of you who don't know me, I'm part of the furniture at the physics department. I'm heading the nuclear physics group, and we have at least one student that I recognize here from our group. So, as the title said, I'd like to at least give you a glimpse into some of the things we are doing. But, idea is to give you a flavor, not necessarily turn you into experts on these things. So, how can we utilize these little spies in our universe to learn about some of the miraculous things which puzzles us? A bit of a roadmap. I'll start with a bit of history, and I'm actually planning to bring some of that history to South Africa, because we often tend to look north, for opportunities. And in actual fact, this presentation is also, in a sense, a marketing for an initiative which we have started to plan for, right? Some of the initial steps in this program has already started. So I'll start off with a brief introduction into some of the basic things in nuclear physics. I'll talk about crisis, because that's always interesting. And then we'll talk a little bit about the nature of these little spies, the neutrinos. And then I'd like to bring it down to South Africa. Okay? So radiation is something that we've been studying for more than 100 years. I think all of us at some stage have done an X-ray, so we have Mr. Röntgen to thank for that, for discovering X-rays, and in German it's called Röntgenstrahlung. Richtig? Yeah. So, and of course, a lot of people have played their role in understanding this mysterious nature around things related to radiation. I mean, we are exposed to radiation in all sorts of forms. And thanks to our toys that we have, our detectors, our ability to measure things, we have some handle on some understanding of what radiation is and where it's coming from. So people like urine, for example, is in fact exciting nuclei, or we might be using a nucleus which is in some kind of excited state, and allow, some of the secrets of this small object to share what is actually happening, understanding the structure of the nucleus, etc., etc. I myself find myself actually interested in bits and pieces which are kicked out of nuclei, such as the helium nucleus. I'm more interested in heavier examples of such fragments which are emitted by the nucleus. Today's talk will also touch a bit on beta decay. So we now know that alpha particles are nothing other than helium, chunks of helium nuclei which are emitted. Betas are electrons, which I think all of us are familiar with. And then we have high energy light, high energy gamma radiation, which would be emitted. And all of them have all sorts of different properties. For example, alpha radiation, we know we can stop with a piece of paper. However, if you want to deal with gamma radiation, it's a different story. And I actually brought along an example of such a source. So this guy is getting worried all of a sudden. Guys, I picked this rock up somewhere here on campus. Okay, it's not true. And it turns out that that chalky stuff there is not actually chalk, right? It's not this yellow stuff. But we can, in fact, ensure that we are safe by studying radiation. So just grabbing one of these lead blocks already prevents us from reducing the exposure. So in actual fact, radiation is all around us. We don't just have to worry about it when we live close to Kuba. It's in the walls, it's within yourself, right? So that's something to take note of. And we've been working on investigating the nucleus from all sorts of angles, but also utilizing that knowledge which we are gaining to actually apply it. For example, those very gammas which are emitted by a rock like that could also be used to fingerprint what's inside that rock. And the reason for that is gamma rays emitted by various elements are emitted in very distinct bundles of energy. We call them photons, and these photons, in the case of my fingerprinting, has a very distinct energy pattern associated with that. We actually find a similar trend or picture when we study alpha radiation, the emission of alpha particles. They tend to also be emitted out of our excited nucleus and carry away a very distinct energy. So those of you who are doing quantum mechanics, that will probably ring a bell that there's some kind of quantization behind these so-called spectra. The problem, however, comes in when we look at the middle guy, the betas, beta decay. So one would expect that these electrons, these beta particles which are emitted by an excited nucleus, such as carbon-14, would also show a very distinct peak at a very particular energy. However, Mother Nature likes to throw curveballs at us. And what the experimentalists found was, you go and measure the energy of your emitted electrons, then you get this very clear and distinct spread. It's not a fixed value as was expected. And that initially created a puzzle. And I mean, we as scientists, we like puzzles, right? We like mysteries. We are like detectives. So people then set out to try and understand what was going on. Some of the experimentalists, some well-known physicists were trying to unravel this weird mystery around this spread of energies which our electrons would be carrying away. So, of course, you know, if you don't necessarily have, or if you don't have direct experimental evidence for something, then you start to make guesses, right? And it was guessed by people like Pauli that there must be some kind of third actor in this story, a third particle, which is electrically neutral. It's not positive or negative, which is accompanying this decay of our beta particle. In fact, they also actually named this particle. Yes?
Sorry, what's the y-axis on my graph?
So this is the count. So how many electrons are you counting
in this,
you know, with a certain energy? Okay, so there's definitely an unknown entity, an unknown actor participating in this beta decay. And because they couldn't detect it at the time, that obviously left some question marks around it. And they actually named it, they called it the neutron initially. And we know that, in fact, the neutron was later discovered by by Chadwick as a partner inside the nucleus, a partner to the proton. So they then very quickly renamed this unknown particle and called it the baby of the neutron, the little neutral neutrino, coined after Enrico Fermi. Right? So it's the bambino of the neutron. Fermi, as a good scientist, wanted to share this idea with the world in a Nature paper. And this paper was sadly very quickly rejected because whoever reviewed it believed that you needed some experimental evidence which indicated that there was something hinting towards the so-called third particle. So this was one of the comments sent out by one of the reviewers. So that means as scientists we are going to look for evidence, right? We need to also knock on the doors of people in the experimental sciences. And in fact, people like Mr. Wong proposed an idea which was taken further, and if you actually look at the timelines, Wong proposed this idea of using electron capture to detect these neutrinos. So essentially just doing the reverse of what is producing the neutrinos to try and create a signature, an experimental signature in some kind of detectable material or detectable setup, which will hint towards the existence of these so-called neutrinos. And if you look at the timeline, almost 14 years after this idea was proposed, Cohen and Reines eventually performed the first experiment which detected the existence of these neutrinos. So Mr. Reines plays a very important role also in a bit of the history of science, and more specifically subatomic physics in South Africa. By the way, it took them a while before these two gentlemen were awarded the Nobel Prize in physics. Okay, so it tends to take a bit longer during experimental physics. This was the idea that your neutrino, in this case it's an anti-electron neutrino, interacts with P+, which is a proton, and produces a neutron. And this guy, what is that guy? Mr. Bormann. That's your positron. So in this reaction, this neutrino captured by a proton, a positron, an anti-electron is produced. And as scientists, we know that positrons, these anti-electrons, whenever they encounter the opposite particle, which is the electron, they annihilate and produce two gamma rays. Okay? These gamma rays can be detected. We have all sorts of gamma detectors which will allow us to detect these gamma rays. And protons are quite readily available. Right? We drink stuff. There's somebody with a whole bunch of protons in a bottle. Right? Water molecule contains two protons. Right? So we could actually use water as a material to detect the existence or detect an interaction which involves a neutrino or an antineutrino in this particular case. So those pioneering experiments have led to a whole series of more complex and more involved experiments involving neutrinos, essentially to understand the nature of neutrinos and perhaps even find ways to make the detection of these neutrinos more available. Right? So what do we know about these neutrinos? Well, we know that they are fundamental in nature. So you can't break them up into smaller things. Right? They come in two different flavors. So we as physicists, Professor Weigel, they have all sorts of cool names for things. These neutrinos come in three different classes or flavors. The electron neutrino, muon, and the tau neutrinos. All has to do with how these neutrinos are produced by various decays. And then neutrinos also behave like magnetic-like objects, magnetic-like particles. They have a spin half, like our electrons. Right? But they're a little bit strange, right? Because we know electrons are positive, electrons are negatively charged, positrons are positively charged. These guys don't have a charge, which is one of the puzzling things. And they have supposedly a partner, an antiparticle, which is one of the things that started to let people think about the nature of these neutrinos. So if you want to know about Dirac particles and the whole nature of these neutrinos, we have the experts here as well. What we also know is that we initially thought they were massless. Now we know they do have mass. They have a very small mass. But that's one of the challenges, one of the experimental challenges. We're still not exactly sure what the masses of these particles are. And the other challenging thing is that it's very, very difficult to detect them. They tend to interact through the weak interaction. So they're almost transparent to everything, which is part of the whole challenge around neutrino physics. And I'll talk a little bit about this as well. So we have to come up with innovative ideas to at least enhance the detectability of these neutrino particles. As I mentioned, one of the challenges is that these guys are very difficult to detect. They're not easy to see in a sense. So let's get back to our little spies and some of the ideas which one can exploit. If you can detect these neutrinos, how can we use that? Now we know that neutrinos are produced when things like our protons and neutrons, for example, decay. So you have a proton or a neutron sitting somewhere surrounded by other protons and neutrons inside your nucleus. And depending on the conditions, in certain conditions, these protons and neutrons are a little bit energized, right? They are in a bit of an energetic state. And they get rid of that surplus energy by decaying themselves. So neutrons, if you haven't known this, neutrons can decay into protons. It's one of the ways in which elements can change, right? And they produce our beta minus particle, the electron, and an anti-electron neutrino. In the same way, we could have an electron which might want to create a more sort of stable environment inside the nucleus by decaying into a neutron, producing an anti-electron and an electron neutrino. Okay? So these processes are happening inside nuclei. They're there. We have our electrons coming out as a beta particle. We have the neutrinos also being emitted from the nucleons, protons and neutrons inside the nucleus. And in fact, some of these processes are happening right inside our bodies. It's part of us. We don't realize it, but it's there. Okay? One of the processes, one of the elements we are well familiar with is carbon. We call ourselves carbon-based life forms. And yet 70% of our body is made up of other stuff, right? But anyway, there's a lot of carbon there as well. And we actually utilized the radioactive carbon to figure out how old certain things are, fossils, for example. Right? And one of the isotopes of carbon is carbon-14. That's the one we use to kind of date the age of certain, prehistoric animals, for example. Maybe a few thousand years' time, they'll dig you up and they'll measure the amount of carbon-14 remaining. And why carbon-14 doesn't stay there is because it decays through beta decay with our anti-electron neutrino coming off to produce nitrogen. The other stuff that makes up our proteins, right? So those processes are happening right there. And I can't see it because neutrinos don't like to share their secrets with us. Okay? They all form part of the life cycle, the carbon cycle. Right? So up there in the atmosphere, cosmic radiation from wherever the sun, other stars, they interact with our nitrogen 14 to produce carbon 14. And while you are enjoying your steak during lunchtime, or the other people are enjoying their steak during lunchtime, that carbon 14, which ends up in our food, ends up in us. So, in fact, you are emitting neutrinos while you are sitting there. You're emitting electrons, you're emitting a lot of other things as well. But there are also other environments where neutrinos are produced. For example, certain nuclei are quite active, like the yellow stuff which sits in here. That's a bit of uranium oxide there. Okay, you're safe. Okay, it's safe. I put the lead shield as well, just to make absolutely sure you're safe. So, uranium-235 has a tendency to be a bit wobbly and break apart and produce things which are still quite energetic. And these nuclei also tend to emit things like neutrinos. Now, when you often think of uranium, you think of Coburg, you think of nuclear reactors, you think of other things which are not so nice, right, which happened in the past. But we often don't think about our homes, this big rock we're living on, right? There's actually evidence that in the past, this big rock which we are standing on acted like a nuclear reactor. And Gabon, there's a site, Oklo, where they found conditions which in the past were ideal for such a georeactor to exist. So those of you who are doing geology, that's an interesting thing. Okay? And of course, as human beings, we'd like to synthesize those processes as well. Right? So here at the West Coast, we have a similar process producing energy, releasing energy. Some of that energy gets converted into heat and so on. And, you know, we don't have load shedding, we're getting some electricity from Cuba. Once again, neutrinos are coming out of things like these reactors. So if we have a way to detect these neutrinos, we can learn something about nature. We can also learn something about what's happening at places like Cuba, if you know how to do it. I've mentioned Oklo, and in fact our own Earth has a lot of geology that's taking place, but there's also a lot of nuclear physics taking place. In our soil, down below, there are various concentrations of various radioactive elements. Potassium, you eat your bananas, right? There's uranium in the soil, in the concrete we use in our walls. All of them are producing neutrinos. And this idea that rock and various forms of sediment down here on Earth, and also various regions here on Earth, could carry some of these elements which emits something which we would like to detect and learn about what's happening there, those hotspots. These things could actually share some of Mother Earth's secrets as well. So from physics you can go to geology. And there are huge detectors in places like Japan simply dedicating their time to detect these neutrinos. So you can't detect them that readily, that easily. Then you get a lot of eyes to look for it. Okay? And this is essentially the idea behind the Kamalan detector. You have lots of little detectors. Each one of these little segments contains a bunch of eyes. So there's an eye looking out for neutrinos, and there are lots of them. Whenever a neutrino passes by, sometimes you're lucky and you detect one of them. Okay, so these things are looking out for geoneutrinos produced from down below. But there's one bit of a problem here, and this is actually these big detectors will detect neutrinos, but they won't really tell you where these neutrinos are are coming from. Where's the source of these neutrinos? And that is because you lose directional information when you try to tackle the problem using these huge things. Right? You just want to detect something. Okay? So here in South Africa, we've actually had a project, and this project is a little bit on ice at the moment. It's called the Earth Detector. And the Earth Detector main goal is to develop a neutrino sensitive detector which can give you information about where those neutrinos are coming from. A directional sensitive neutrino. Okay? As you can see, the shape, it has a pyramid-like shape. So everything is trying to point back that, we're coming back to Africa in a sense. But there are various other similar detectors that's been developed all over the world. We've also been working very closely with a few other facilities. The one in China, I have a very, very good link with the group in China. And they are actually also looking, part of that program is looking for geoneutrinos. Our sun, the biggest body here in our solar system, is a source of nuclear radiation. Now, if you've watched the news, we've been trying to reproduce what the sun is doing, right? The sun is producing a lot of energy, and it is relatively more cost-effective from an energy point of view than many of the other things we have around us. Yes.
I'm not sure you can see this point, but I just want to find out how fast they move the neutrinos. Are they moving about the speed of sound or no?
They are moving close to the speed of sound depending on the environment they're in, but they're not at the speed of sound. I mean, not speed of light, thank you. Speed of light, yeah. So because the neutrinos have mass, yeah, thank you. Because the neutrinos have mass, that limits them. They can't reach the speed of light. All right, so are you a physics student? Okay, if you haven't done relativity, special relativity yet, you're going to get there. Okay, you understand why, right? So they can move quite fast. The sun itself is a factory of all sorts of things, not only neutrinos, but some of the elements we have here on Earth, helium, for example, right? The lighter elements, some of them can be produced in such a factory like the sun. And of course, if it's producing neutrinos and we have some way of detecting neutrinos, we can create a little neutrino picture of what's happening in the sun. So since we can't get there ourselves, we use other indirect ways of accessing information shared by these seemingly inaccessible environments, okay? By utilizing things like neutrinos. We can also use neutrinos to kind of warn us. So coming back to your question, neutrinos move fast, they don't move at the speed of light, but if they are moving and they come from somewhere, they can actually share information about the environment which created them. So the sun, I mentioned, is a relatively, not a big star, sort of an intermediate sized star. But you do find stars which are much, much larger than the sun. And every now and then, some of these huge stars reach the end of their life, and part of their evolution towards the end of that life involves a huge explosion, so-called supernova explosion. So when these stars actually explode, it sends out a huge number of neutrinos going out into space. And if your detector is here somewhere on Earth, right, and you don't get destroyed by these supernova explosions, you're still around, then these neutrinos will reach you. And we in fact have detectors like the Kamalan detector with lots of neutrino eyes, neutrino detectors looking for these elevated levels of neutrinos produced by these so-called supernova explosions.
Are those detectors quite temperature sensitive, meaning like, is that also kept at an extremely low temperature?
They are, yeah. So our experts in experimental physics will tell you that temperature plays a role, but we are also clever, right? We can deal with them, right? So you try to usually, place these detectors in an environment where the temperature is not fluctuating too much. And you don't have to look too far to find them, okay? And they're quite big. So there are two guys, I don't know if they're cleaning these detectors. I think they're just checking it. So that gives you a sense of the scale of these things.
With these detectors, do we not get a direction as to where these neutrinos are coming from? With these
Not with these ones, but if you have 1, 2, 3, this one detects something, next one detects it somewhere else, then you can, like with your cell phone, you can figure out where you are, right?
Okay.
You can find out where they might be coming from. So you kind of get an estimate of where and of course, I mean, if you wanna confirm something, you don't just go for one way, right? So this is one tool among maybe a series of other tools which would be looking out for these supernova explosions. So we have, our friends in astronomy also looking for supernova explosions using other means. Some point the light will reach us, for example. So yeah. So let's bring it back to our home turf. And this to me is actually, when I initially, put this set of slides together, this was kind of an exciting moment because South Africa's been in the neutrino physics game for a long time. And in actual fact, the reason why we've made our mark there, and I don't think many people are aware of this, is because we are good at digging holes. So if you go to the East Rand, right, you'll find lots of holes being dug. Right? And if you're a geologist, you'll know why. Actually, all of us probably know why. Right? We have a lot of gold, and we have the deepest mines in the world. So they're already starting to stretch below, 4 kilometers. So Mr. Reines, whom I've mentioned earlier on, along with one of our former physicists, Friedrich Schallschop, who, by the way, did his master's here in this very department, the two of them put a team together, and they went into one of the deepest mine on Earth at that stage. They took along a very huge detector, probably almost about half the length of this table, called a scintillator detector. They had to also work according to the schedule of the mine, so it was kind of challenging. If you forget your screwdriver somewhere, you have to wait for the next shift. And they went about, under the leadership of Friedrich Reines, to look for so-called cosmic neutrinos. And the first cosmic neutrinos, the first naturally detected neutrinos, were detected close to Johannesburg. And when I presented this to one of these audiences, of this average age of about 70, there was a gentleman there who was actually a student who worked on this particular project. I think he moved to Cape Town because the wine is better here and life is much more relaxed. But yeah, so we've been part of this history which was made in the 1960s, and this actually led to a publication as well. Right? So this actually sparked this idea of reviving this project around not only neutrinos but actually a bigger thing. And well, people started to think, especially our colleagues at WITS, they thought, well, okay, this is a nice sort of idea. We have mines not far from us. We can try and develop something there. So they're still developing it. And while they are developing something around this, we in Cape Town thought, well, we're a little bit more chilled. We don't have to go and dig a hole. We're going to look for a hole. Right, so you'll see there's a bunch of institutions which are familiar to you. There's the Earth Foundation, which has been funding this detector. There's VITS up in Gauteng, and the rest are all in the Western Cape. Right? There's us, of course. So it's a multi-institutional program which we are getting underway. And here in Stellenbosch, we've been enticing people with our beautiful sceneries, getting all sorts of people from all over the world, and then actually showing them that we are not just enjoying our wine and beaches, but we're actually doing real stuff as well. Because I think often, you know, people, when you think of South Africa, oh, South Africa has good wine, you know. So it's also important that we also showcase our other things, our growing astronomical community. SKA is, of course, on the cards as well. Hermanus has a magnetic observatory, and they are also these days playing around with launching all sorts of things along the south coast. And of course, not far from us. If you haven't visited this facility yet, you can speak to Jeroen. He visits Timberlands quite often. And in actual fact, the interesting thing about your project is it speaks to some of these things which deals with big systems, right? Astronomy as well. So that's an interesting one. So we have infrastructure which could support such programs. We have clever people like yourselves, you know, who can support this. And I'm not just talking about physics students. We need our engineers. We need our people. Where's that lady who put up the camera? We need those people to do the quality check as well, and also check whether the environment is conducive to look for things like neutrinos. So we've embarked on the program, and I don't know about you guys, but I don't like to drive to Gauteng every time. So it turns out we have something that can work for us. There's the Western Cape, and there we are at Stellenbosch, and not far from us, we have a hole. We have the Wyngaardt tunnel sitting there. Right? There's Kuber nuclear power plant, which is about 60 km from this tunnel. And we're not that far from the tunnel either. And basically that's a profile of what the tunnel looks like. There's the tunnel running across through this mountain. There's this huge peak. And the reason why we need this huge rock is to actually use it to screen off things that we don't want to interfere with what we are looking for. Okay? So, as I mentioned, there are lots of sources of things like neutrinos, right? They come and they interact with stuff in the upper atmosphere, and they produce a shower of subatomic particles. We don't see them, but we are constantly exposed to them. We've grown accustomed to them. We've evolved, and we've actually built up resistance to certain things thanks to this interaction of cosmic radiation with the stuff in ourselves. So the tunnel itself actually acts as a shield, which shields out some of these particles in the shower. And you can see only certain particles like our neutrinos and muons would, you know, the other stuff would interact with the gases in the atmosphere, and some of these things would eventually reach the surface of the Earth as well. So if we put a big rock above us, then we can shield some of it off as well. So you've been to Paarl and you've gone to Worcester and you've decided to take the shortcut through the tunnel, that's what you'll see, you know. And if you are like me and you don't just look in front of you, but you also look around, you'll see that there's actually a side tunnel as well. So these two tunnels were developed at the same time, except the one was developed for traffic. The idea was if the traffic picks up, the second tunnel, which is currently a service tunnel, that tunnel would be developed further. And that's why we want to get our foot into this right now. So there's a Stellenbosch University vehicle, actually, I think it's, yeah, Stellenbosch and the Timberlands vehicle, and these guys are in this tunnel. And in fact, you were asking about temperature. You wouldn't know whether it's summer or winter in there. The temperature remains almost the same. And it is like a whole different world. It's like the rest of the world is cut off from you. You know, it's quiet, it's peaceful, I almost want to say it's a dream, but I read some other things as well. Right. So this is right there, and this is what we'd like to, we would like to get a cut of this as well, to do cutting edge research, not only physics, other things as well. And before you spend a lot of money on such facilities, you need to make sure you do your homework, because whoever is going to fund you wants to know that all the boxes have been ticked. So we have my colleague, Professor Newman. These are all former students. These two they completed their PhD here at Stellenbosch. There's Milton van Rooyen and Zina Global. They've moved on. She's at UCT now, so we passed on to UCT so that they can hopefully learn something from us as well. Milton is working at NIMISA. And the job was actually just to go and see what the environment is like. So what's the background? Right? Do you have to worry about uranium oxide or thorium? How would that interfere with our detection of neutrinos? And this is essentially what these guys are doing. They have their data acquisition system. That's our detector. So it's a gamma detector. You can do the fingerprinting with it. There are also smaller detectors. And if you get the opportunity to sneak something else in there, you do it as well. So this has nothing to do with neutrinos. It actually has something to do with the pollution measurements in the actual tunnel, which is, where the cars and things are moving. So we snuck in a little biomonitor which collects lead and all the other stuff there, right? And then we can see what the levels are. So getting back to South Africa, we are in the game of detecting or developing technologies which can also, not only support environments like geology, fundamental physics, etc., right? But we also want to look at all sorts of other applications. And we have one advantage. Some of us would think of it as a disadvantage, but it's in a sense an advantage as well. So if you have a reasonable, pretty efficient neutrino detector, which can tell you where the neutrinos are coming from, then you can point it at all sorts of possible neutrino sources. There are the geoneutrinos, but there's also artificial neutrinos, right? And why I said it's an advantage having one nuclear reactor here in Cape Town is because you don't get interference from other reactors. You don't have the problem that you have in, Japan, for example, where there might be many other reactors around. And you're sitting along a vault where there's all sorts of other things also, coming out of the earth. Africa is geologically relatively stable. And we have one reactor which is emitting neutrinos. So we can sit in our tunnel. If we have such a device, we can actually monitor how things are changing inside these reactors. And I think this is kind of becoming, if we could do this, and I think it's a long way from that, but if one could do this, I think now that would be pretty appropriate to other environments as well. So a few years ago, we had an opportunity to get Milton and the late Rob the Mayor in there. These guys are literally underneath the reactor vessel, and they were out there to try and measure neutrinos. So they're looking for reactor neutrinos, and they're looking for something which seems to show kind of fluctuation. So these neutrinos are kind of strange. They tend to hop from one type to the other. They are oscillating from one type to the other. The so-called neutrino oscillations. Right? But it also turns out if you study neutrino oscillations, then you need a good theorist as well. So this is a good friend of mine, Fedor Simkovic of Slovakia. And he's a theorist. And he's working very closely with the experimentalists from all sorts of facilities at CERN, Mordan, Grand Sassel, Snow Lab, and so on. And essentially what they're trying to do is try to curb the uncertainty around the neutrino masses. So a lot of these things are complementing each other to build a reasonable picture of what's happening around us. Can I just finish before you? Okay, I'm nearly done. Okay, so in Stellenbosch we've developed an environment where we are monitoring all sorts of things, among other things, radon, for example. And if there are things like uranium, thorium in there, radon is a tricky gas. It's a chemically inert gas, but it's radioactive. Okay, and it might actually interfere with these very sensitive measurements. So Professor Newman and his colleagues are looking at the radon levels in this particular environment. We're looking at the gammas. We want to find out what elements are there that might be radioactive as well. And then we're looking at developing a long-term plan. So this tunnel might become part of a bigger program eventually. We might have a facility dedicated to low-level radiation measurements in the tunnel, but also complementing maybe a facility in Gauteng, and we're also looking at identifying all sorts of opportunities in various fields. Our community has been working closely with the astrophysics and astronomy community at some of the other universities. There's also an interest not in neutrinos, but muons, for example. So maybe one could think of using muon tomography to highlight what's happening in what's sitting inside a rock. Biology, the effect of cosmic radiation, and how it affects our bodies on a cellular level. That's a very interesting study. So there's actually a study in Modane in France where they are looking at the effect of cosmic radiation on cells which were grown in the lab, right? So in such a low-level environment lab, and then you have something which is exposed to cosmic radiation outside. So physics itself doesn't stand on its own legs. It's actually also, supporting other environments and vice versa, because the opportunities also lie in other fields. Okay. So yeah, that I think, ladies and gentlemen, is where I think I need to stop. So I am, I think, well in time. Yeah. You had a question, sorry.
You said that the neutrinos they oscillate between like their different types, correct?
Yeah.
So as much as you say we don't know what the mass is, do we know whether the different types of neutrinos have different masses?
That seems to be the case. So even though your uncertainty is maybe, not small.
It is different. We're just
it's
not
different. They also shifted, right? Okay. Relative to zero.
And so I just want to make sure the difficulty with figuring out what that mass is it because it interacts with so many different fundamental forces, we're not sure what attributes to what.
So this is what we know. So it seems like this oscillation actually only occurs if these neutrinos are moving through some form of matter. So if it moves through the atmosphere. There are at least 2 experiments that I know of. One in the US, and the other one is a collaboration between CERN in Switzerland and Gran Sasso, which is in Italy. And essentially what the guys at CERN does is they produce the neutrinos. They literally produce a neutrino beam, which literally passes through the Earth, and it's detected on the other side at Gran Sasso in these tunnels. So those are the, and then they would look for, you had a concentrated beam of neutrinos, so it's much easier to detect these neutrinos and also, get a sense of what type of neutrinos they are. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, last question, because I'm booked for another meeting.
I was really curious about the biological application, because that's more where my background lies. How would one go about detecting something like that on such a small scale? Because it seems to me like all these detectors and things look more at astronomic or very large changes and differences and things, and also are highly controlled environments? How would one go
Okay,
about
so you won't be doing neutrino physics. But what you will do is you will jump onto the opportunity that there is a space where there's very little cosmic radiation. Okay? Unlike your lab at biology, for example, it's getting cosmics the whole time. Right? So there's, in that case, there's an environment which would support such a type of study. Okay? It's not necessarily this, it's something else. Here's another interesting thing, which could be kind of unique if you're coming from a biology point of view. So, I mean, this could in principle be done now. I've been talking about the tunnel, but I haven't been talking about the mines up in Gauteng. And you know, I think as a biologist and a geologist and so on, the deeper you go down the earth, the warmer it gets. So we have the deepest mines here. And there are very unique types of bacteria which have been collected in our mines. They haven't found it anywhere else in the world. So that's something really interesting to maybe look out for. Right? And as I said, you know, one can jump onto these big opportunities and capitalize on that as well. Keisha. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time. Damien, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, supporting me. Yes. Did you maybe no. Cashwell's not here today, but maybe if it's someone Friday, just pop into his office so that he can check on the list. Yes. Well, good afternoon.
Ik wil dit worst opgeven. Oké,